I'm Gil Rosman, and I have the pleasure of chairing this session and contributing one paper to our discussion of national identity issues as they affect North Korea, and North Korea within the context of Northeast Asia. This is sponsored by the Korean Economic Institute, which has organized a panel on national identities, along with 3 other panels that already have been completed. And we're all grateful to KEI and the staff who are here for helping us get this panel going. I think we will have some innovative results to present. And so first, let me introduce our panelist. To my immediate left is Sandra Fahy, assistant professor at Sophia Joji University in Tokyo. She's a specialist on North Korean human rights, humanitarian intervention in North Korea. She has her PhD from SOAS in London, and at the University of London, and an MA from York University, and she taught at Seoul National University and also did an extended postdoc at USC. So I think you will find what she's doing very innovative in terms of understanding the linkages between the South Korean defectors and their families and communities back in North Korea. Further to my left is Ji-Yoon Kim from the Asan Center, Asan Institute. She's the director of their Center for Public Opinion and Quantitative Research. She has a BA from Yonsei University, went on to study at Berkeley, and received her PhD at MIT. She also has postdoc experience, and she's been producing a wonderful array of products at the Asan Institute on the public opinion in South Korea, analyzing how opinion has changed. And today she will share some findings about national identity and how the North Korean defectors are viewed by the South Korean population. I will be presenting a paper that was a little different from what these two presenters are discussing. I will look at Japan's thinking about North Korea and look at Japan in the context of the struggle between revisionism and realism in its outlook on the outside world, also looking at Japan's thinking about Russia and to some degree South Korea in the context of this overall discussion. So that is where we're heading. Let me say a few words about national identities before I turn the floor over to Sandra, because all of us are concerned about ways of understanding national identity, and some are hesitant about using this concept or use it in a rather narrow way, and I don't think people grasp the significance of a national identity approach for understanding many issues, particularly in East Asia. And so there are many dimensions to it, whether it's ideology or history or views of the outside world, and particularly bilateral relations that flares up, a view of the own structure of what's the ideal structure of your society, what makes your country distinct. And I think you'll find that we are going to be taking 3 different approaches to national identity. One, a more micro approach, emphasizing individuals and communities from an anthropological perspective. One, a public opinion approach using polling data, analyzing attitudes towards national identity from the background of political science and public opinion. And a third, emphasizing more published sources and debates in countries and how they reveal how national identities are evolving. So those are the three perspectives we'll be presenting, and now I turn the floor over to Sandra.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for coming at such an early hour. I really appreciate it. And I'd like to thank the Korea Economic Institute for inviting me to join this panel. And it was very inspirational, actually, because, you know, when I think of the Korea Economic Institute, the first thing I think of is money. And, you know, I thought, okay, I've been wanting for a long time to write something about money and remittances to North Korea. And I've been wanting for a long time to write about how those remittances are sent back into North Korea, and also family. But then they also said, well, you have to talk about unification or national identity. And I thought, well, let's see if I can put those things together. And so it was kind of an intellectual journey for me, and it was quite enjoyable. So let's see how the ideas unfold. I look forward to your feedback, and I will begin. Basically, what I've done with the PowerPoint is I've outlined my arguments. So, you know, if you want to just pay attention to the paper, that's fine, but the bulk and the central ideas are placed up there for you. So let's begin. Moving from the powerful and abstract construct of ethnic homogeneity as bearing the promise of reunification, this paper instead considers family unity, which is facilitated by the quotidian and ubiquitous tools of mobile phones and money, a force with a demonstrated record showing existing practices of unification on the peninsula today. From the small unification, 작은 통일, that North Korean defectors speak about, where they bring family members out of North Korea, they pay brokers to bring family members out, to the role of voice, the individual voice of North Korean defectors that are transmitted back into North Korea via the mobile phone. These phones are illegally smuggled through China, and also through the money that's sent through these mobile phones. This paper explores new conceptions of reunification presently manifesting on the Korean peninsula. So I want us to play with this idea of what unification means. So national identity on both sides of the peninsula is usually linked with ethnic homogeneity. The ultimate idea of Koreanness present on both sides and throughout Korean history. Ethnic homogeneity is linked with nationalism, and while it is evoked as the rationale for reunification, it has not had that result and did not prevent the ideological nationalism that divided the Korean ethnos during the Korean War. So the construction of ethnic homogeneity evokes the idea that all Koreans are of one brethren, dongpo, an image of one large, genetically related extended family. But fissures in this ideal exist, highlighting instead the strength of genetic family ties. Moving from the powerful and abstract notion of the construct of ethnic homogeneity as bearing the promise for reunification, instead, I consider family unity, again, through these tools of mobile phones, money, and the voice. And these show demonstrated practices of acts of unification on the peninsula. So I could go into the work of Gyok Shin, and he talks about ethnic homogeneity and how it has not, as I mentioned, reunified the peninsula, and how it was not enough to bring Koreans together despite the Korean War. But I won't go into that because I don't, I'm sure you're all familiar with that literature and you can look at it yourself. But I want to identify how intergroup dynamics of censure have existed on both sides of the peninsula. And these sanction, quote, certain unlikable in-groups as primary threats to national identity. And they complicate unification through ideological censure. So the message we have here is of containment and of treatment. So Seungmin Rhee, for instance, his evocation of communism as a cholera that would compromise democracy can easily be evoked here. It's something that is a contagion and needs to be contained and quarantined and treated. So for instance, we have North Koreans who defect and then they enter a place called Hanawon where they are re-educated and things like this. Of course, taught how to adapt to South Korean society very legitimately. Both North and South Korea have endeavored to ensure control over the leakage of information from each other. In the South, the 1948 National Security Act liberally criminalized communist sympathizers as pro-North Korean, posing a threat to the government of the South. And antagonism toward North Korean-related content grew more overt in 1980s with the Anti-Communism Act. For instance, the work of Danielle Chubb, 2014, identifies that anti-government elements were seen as having communist tendencies and thus labeled as pro-North Korean. Other scholars have, of course, pointed that out too. So, for instance, if you try to access the website Uri Minjokgiri in South Korea today, roughly translated as Our People Together, you won't be able to access it, but I can easily access it in Tokyo. This has caused some people, for instance, Reporters Without Borders and Amnesty International, to critique South Korea society as a slightly censorship state. So, to kind of round up this argument, Gyeokshin observes that unification approaches of both Koreas are based on the premise that ethnic unity ought to be ultimately the thing that leads to reunification. So this ideology is something which is separating people, but ethnic aspects are something which can unify people. So the definition of the, quote, fundamental norm and identity associated with the category of the ethnic nation is a point of conflict for each of the Koreas as they try to claim legitimacy and entitlement of the ethnic territory that is currently occupied, in the case of South Korea by US and in the case of North Korea. So I'm going to move into my argument. Here, I identify practices of unification. So we have this small unification which is happening on the peninsula, where North Korean defectors pay brokers to bring their family out. We see the evidence of mobile phones, which are Chinese, being smuggled back in, and identify this as a technology and social network that are producing new practices of unification. Gil, would you mind to pass me the bottle of water? Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much. So the division of the peninsula has also meant division of families, which we all know. And the problem of divided families has been variously dealt with by both Koreas, but also by the United States and Japan. The vast majority of families were divided during the Korean War, with the remainder being divided in the wake of the Korean War. And the first generation of these divided families has little time remaining. So some of you may be aware that in 1983, KBS set up the, quote, campaign to reunite 10 million divided families. And this was spearheaded by a Korean-Canadian reporter of the New York Times. The telethon lasted 453 hours and 45 minutes and resulted in the reunion of 10,000 of the 109,000 families who applied to find their loved ones. The KBS campaign was the first to unite families who were divided within the Korean peninsula and abroad, with the omission of kin in North Korea. The paper goes into details about other campaigns for the divided families. For instance, in the US, the Divided Families Foundation also helped to reunite several families. And over the time of tensions on the peninsula, this has waxed and waned. But as an anthropologist, you know, the primary social institution of the family is interesting to me because it already demonstrates the promise of reunification as people on the ground in South Korea and North Korea forge unification practices in daily life. And as I mentioned, they principally do this through mobile phones and money. So when defectors remark that they wish to return to North Korea, as my research has shown, when and if the country reunifies, it is not the political ideology or ethnic homogeneity which they are seeking, but rather family and friends remaining there. So to reconnect with community is what North Koreans are seeking, rather than nationalism or ethnicity per se. And it may come as a surprise to you to learn that in a country that has an international reputation for crimes against humanity, the people themselves have a warm heart, 따뜻한 마음, and many North Koreans talk about this. A warm heart and even casual banter are common ways defectors characterize the people of North Korea. quote, even warmer than South Koreans, my informant said, to express the spirit of North Koreans. When I asked her if North Koreans were as warm as South Koreans, I was expressing to her my own personal experience between living in Japan and living in South Korea. I noticed that Koreans tend to be a bit warmer in my personal experience. And she said, oh no, North Koreans are much warmer even than South Koreans. She said, quote, when you get on a bus or a trolley, they will ask you, where are you from? Where are you going? How are you doing? That kind of thing. People readily talk to one another in a friendly way, end quote. So family is not only about who is related to whom by blood or marriage, it is also about exchange. It is about the insurance of generational descent, and it is also an insurance against loss of wealth. So the structuralist method of studying kinship, formulated in the work of Levi-Strauss, is about alliances and networks of exchange. So, of course, in my field, we identify this as a primary social institution, common to virtually all peoples across time and place. But, of course, it is culturally contingent and place contingent. So family unity being the most primary institution, it shapes value formation and economic outcomes, and it influences national institutions. Economists who study the effect of family ties on economics find that strong family ties actually impede economic development. And these studies identify places like Italy, for instance. Where family ties are strongest, there is a greater tendency to distrust those outside the family unit and maximize material gain within the family institution. Although strong family ties are linked with low political participation and political action, they are positively correlated with happiness and health. They correlate with good codes of conduct within small circles, such as within family or kin, but they are also identified with selfishness outside of the family network. It's very interesting research. If you read the article, you can see all the references I identify for that. Now, Bruce Cummings, whose work you will be familiar with, identifies familialism as something that has shaped North Korea's national self-image. So some of you who are familiar with North Korea's propaganda material will be aware that Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un are generally represented as parental benevolent figures for the state. Kim Suk-young and other authors have done a lot of excellent work on this. I won't go into those details, but we just take it as rote. So the family network as the overarching and oldest of social institutions cannot be overemphasized in the lives of North Koreans or defectors. Family ties have facilitated the movement of defectors through the region, making their lives more resilient and more transnational. So now in the 1990s, we saw that North Koreans came out because of the famine, but nowadays we see more and more this chagin tangil, people coming out because of family unity. They're basically bringing their family members out. Not always. Some people argue and say, I don't want to come out. But anyway, we can get into that later during the Q&A. Insights from contemporary defector experiences show that the most basic of social institutions signals ways forward for our conceptualizing of unification. Family ties are able to be maintained across borders because of money and mobile phones. These are objects which facilitate practices of family unity and help us to think again about practices of unification on the peninsula. So I'm going to move quickly now into, I should have flipped through that, but mobile phones. So how do North Koreans call, North Korean defectors call their family members back home? These are mobile phones which have been purchased in China, often during their defection period in China, and they use a Chinese telecom network, and then they are smuggled back into North Korea via friends or brokers, which then deliver them to family members and friends. The telephone number is noted and can be contacted via telephones anywhere in the world, so long as the battery is charged up. Thus, when North Koreans arrive in South Korea, even from the Hanawon Center, which I had the privilege of visiting, they use the local phone boxes, which are in Hanawon, to call their family in North Korea. And they can relay information directly in real time. And this is very powerful, I think, for us to think about. So there's no fear of North Korea being able to tap these phones as they are communicating through Chinese telecoms. The risk for North Korean residents, of course, comes if your conversation is overheard or if your phone rings when the wrong person is present. But defectors in China, South Korea, and Japan are able to maintain contact. If they're near the border, the telephone can receive signals from Chinese cell phone towers. And detection equipment is used by the North Korean government to determine who is using a Chinese cell phone. So clandestine, quick, and irregular use is essential to avoid getting caught with these illicit devices. And there's some research that shows that North Koreans are now using a kind of coded speech on the telephones to be even quicker when they're communicating. Again, the paper goes into details about how long mobile phones have existed in North Korea, the penetration of mobile phones into North Korea, etc. I won't go into that. So when examining the impact of new information and communication technology, there is a tendency to focus on the Internet as a revolutionary force. But research on poor and low-income countries and places where the Internet is limited indicates that change in such places happens instead through mobile phones, which is far more influential than the Internet. So it is an economical and efficient means of redistributing money among those who are poor and disadvantaged. So new social alternatives become possible through the mobile phone. The mobile phone speeds up and makes more reliable former low-tech ways of keeping in touch, such as word of mouth, which would have been the case in the past. When earlier defectors left North Korea, their contact with family was almost certainly severed. However, with the use of mobile phones, relations are maintained. Reuniting can be carried out more safely and with greater care through the use of the phone. Okay, you might be familiar, for instance, that we have like Chayu Pukan Bangsong, like Free North Korea Radio, things like this that are directly sending broadcasts. And this has been happening for decades into North Korea. And of course, there's a lot of debate on both sides of the DMZ about this as a propaganda device. The North, of course, was sending information to the South as well. But what I like about the mobile phone is that the individual voice of the defector is transmitted directly back into North Korea. And she or he can say whatever they wish, really. And so I see this as a kind of micro-broadcast. Okay, yes, as I say, the mobile phone, North Koreans voice themselves and their current lived experience of South Korea back into North Korea. And this I identify as greater familial intimacy than the broadcasts of Free North Korea Radio. Because the radio is a monologue, whereas the telephone call is a dialogue. So the radio, you know, it selects acceptable messages which are broadcast back to listeners. So the dialogue of the telephone, I think it offers, you know, greater opportunities for exchange of ideas. Okay, I'm going to skip the section that I talk about the DVDs and information on that. Okay, I'll move on to the section about money. Okay, one of the first things that North Koreans learn to do when they arrive in South Korea is send money back to the North. And the expression in North Korea is, this is the Mount Hala stream. So it trickles money back into North Korea as a mountain lets water flow from its peak. One of the first things they learn to do is send this money back through the use of mobile phones. And this is arranged, it's illegal remittances, basically. So how does this work? According to one of my informants, quote, they can get money in 5 minutes. 5 minutes, he repeated. That's much quicker than I can send money from Tokyo to Los Angeles. Recipients do not need to reside along the border region inland for transfers to occur. Let's see if I go into some of the details about how they transmit. Yes, okay. So a defector in South Korea contacts his South Korean-based broker, sending him money via his South Korean bank account. This is all on the telephone. The broker then sends the money to his Chinese broker via mobile phones or internet banking, and the broker in China sends the money to his contact in North Korea, directly delivering the money to him, or via a remittance house in North Korea. You can find references to this in the article. According to a survey in 2010 by the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, 49.5% of North Koreans sent money back into North Korea, and 74% of women send money back into North Korea, but also into China if they have left children or family in China. And these remittances contribute to the unofficial economy and development in North Korea, and perhaps in time could signal the development of an unofficial economic class. So I'll just conclude by saying that for me, this is a really exciting and innovative kind of practice that's happening. We typically think of unification as happening between two states, and I really think that that argument is at a stalemate, but that these practices, which happen below the state level, demonstrate that people are actually engaging in practices of unification now. And for those of you who have family who live abroad, I guess if I were to ask you, probably everybody would put up their hand that they have family and friends who live abroad, or that you live away from your family and friends. And the way that you stay in touch is through technology. I mean, for most of us, it's probably through Skype, because it's cheaper and it's quicker and it's reliable. But for many people, and especially for people in poor countries, it's through the mobile phone. And so in many ways, I feel that North Koreans are entering this new global phenomenon that we're all experiencing in terms of distance and engaging with family members in their absence. You know, we maintain ties with our loved ones despite their absence, through their absence, but with technology. And of course, you know, sometimes parents send money to their kids in this manner too, but always it's this communication that happens back and forth. So I think it's a kind of exciting idea to explore further. So thank you for listening.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ji-Yoon Kim, and I first have to express my gratitude to KI and Professor Pete Rosman to giving me this opportunity to have a presentation here. After hearing Sandra's presentation, I think I cannot deny that South Koreans are colder than the North Koreans, and I'm one of a kind who's much colder than the average South Korean, and feel really terrible to have a presentation here with this paper, because I can show you really, really cold face of South Korean toward the North Korean defectors. All right. So I'm going to introduce South Korea's attitude toward North Korean defectors, most recent attitude, and then the most result are from Asan Institute's daily poll conducted in 2014 in February. Some of you probably are familiar with the South Korean culture and the movies and pop arts, and then may recognize what this movie is about. This is called Ode to My Father. It's an English title, which is really weird as a matter of fact, I think. But in Korean, it's called 국제시장. It literally means international market. This movie was released in December 2014, and it hit a jackpot, basically, and it drew like more than 10 million viewers. 10 million South Koreans went to watch this movie. Just briefly explain this movie. It is about a story about a boy who and his family who escaped from North Korea. I think our National Assemblyman, Mr. Park Jin, Dr. Park Jin, he has the same experience with this one, I remember. My father. Yeah, so it was Kimchi 5, was it? Yeah. Anyway, so they escaped from North Korea during the Korean War, and came down to all the way to Busan for the survival. And during the flee, they missed the two family members. One is his father, the main character's father, whose name is Toksu, and his younger sister. And the rest is all in the depicting all the hardships and difficulties that the family and himself had to go through, and intertwined with the South Korea's and post-war, the period, the events, national events, and everything like Vietnam War and going to the West Germany and etc. And it reaches its climax when Toksu, the main character, finds his younger sister. As Sandra introduced, the 1983, the nationally held campaign, looking for and searching for the family members separated during the Korean War. And he there finds his long lost younger sister. And So it's basically telling you about this guy who sacrificed his life and for the sake of their own family. But what this movie caught my eyes is two reasons. First, Doctor's family, who escaped from North Korea, came down to Busan during the wartime, is literally the first kind of North Korean defectors, as a matter of fact. They flew away from the North Korea looking for the survival, and everything is almost the same. And secondly, the movie contains the fact that still we are one Korea. I mean, he is from North Korea, and he's just, looking for his younger sister so hard. And finally, it says that, and sending the message that it's one Korea. We used to be one people. And apparently, but the defectors of nowadays in South Korea are not perceived the same way. It's totally different. And that's what I'm going to discuss today. The influx of defectors in South Korea has increased dramatically in 1990s because of famine in North Korea. Before then, we had rare events of having the North Korean defectors, just a small number of people, very handful of people. And once they came down to South Korea from North, they were welcomed with open arms and become instant celebrity almost. And because, it was good political propaganda than South Korean authoritarian government. Well, you can say that, well, look at these people. I mean, our system is much better, and the defectors prove it. Right? That's why they flew down from the North Korea. So it's a great political propaganda, and it's a really rare kind. And North Korean defectors and their families are televised, and they were used in many ways. But once South Korea consolidates its democracy system, then it turns out that, well, we do not have much of the political usage in the North Korean defectors. And also, sort of a North Korean defectors market become more competitive because you see more of them. So it's a very different situation for the North Korean defectors compared with what it was like I don't know, like 30 years ago or 40 years ago. So as a consequence, the South Korean public's attitude also have changed. And that is a very dramatic change, as a matter of fact. But still, those North Korean defectors, they receive the citizenship almost, upon their arrival. Of course, they have to go through some of the process, checking out whether or not there's espionage or just simply they flew from North Korea because of looking for survival. But they got the citizenship almost upon arrival, and also they got the government subsidies, which is totally different from other migrant groups coming to South Korea. But still, it is a question that its legal system is kind of supporting the North Korean defectors, but still a question that is South Korean are accepting them with open arms and welcoming them with a warm heart. So I'm just going to show you some of the poll results. This is not from Asan Institute, but it is from the Institute for the Peace and Unification Studies at the Seoul National University. And they have been doing the survey from 2007 until very recently. And this is sentiment toward North Korean defectors by the South Korean public. And they asked, how do you feel close to North Korean defectors or not? And as you see, the numbers going between 35% feel that, well, I feel close to them, and up to 42 or 43%. Well, the numbers and the figures, the statistics is always in the eyes of the beholder, so you can interpret it on your way, but well, it is slightly increasing. People have slightly and gradually have more welcoming attitude toward North Korean people, and well, yeah, I feel close to them. But to me, it sounds like, well, still more than half of South Koreans do not really feel close to the North Korean defectors. And that is actually one thing that we have to pay attention to. And I do not have the slide in here, but there's a follow-up question about a more relationship, more specified relationship. Are you okay with having North Korean defectors in your neighborhood? Are you okay to have North Korean defectors as a colleague and a business partner and with the marital relationship? So it's getting a more intense and intimate relationship. And as the question becomes about more intimate relationship, South Korean people tend to have reluctance and excuse me, the same thing that Sandra has. Thank you. So about the more intimate relationships, South Koreans' attitude getting colder and colder. So for example, when we ask about the marital relationship, so are you willing to have marital relationship with the North Korean defectors, then it was only 23% of South Koreans said, yeah, why not? The rest is, oh, well, I don't know, maybe, or no, I don't want to. So basically, you are okay with living or co-living with them in the neighborhood, but you don't really want to make a kind of intimate relationship with the North Korean defectors. What is also personally to me is this. So they ask the questions of, do you think we have to accept all the North Korean defectors unconditionally, or do you think we have to selectively accept them? Well, if you see the number in 2007, the 52% of South Koreans answered that we have to accept all the defectors. I mean, before, like 20 years ago or 30 years ago, it was an unwritten rule, almost, that you have to accept North Korean defectors no matter what. I mean, they took a life at risk to run away from that oppressive regime and coming down to South Korea looking for freedom. How can you refuse them? And if you refuse them, and then you have to send them back to North Korea, and it means that, basically executing them. But you just see the number is actually declining slightly, and in 2013, as a matter of fact, 45.2% of South Koreans answered that, well, we maybe have to selectively accept the North Korean defectors, not all of them. I mean, the difference between those who arguing that we have to accept all of them and do not is just 33%, which means that it is within the margin of errors, but it doesn't really mean that much of difference. But still, you can see the slight gradual increase of the people gradually accepting the North Korean defectors. And on the other hand, unconditional admission is not really or a prevalent idea to all the South Korean people. So at this point, we have to ask who the North Korean defectors to South Korean people. I mean, they receive, on their arrival, as I said, they receive citizenship automatically. They receive the government subsidies. It's about like $6,500 per one-person household, and they also got assistance for the housings. I mean, if you immigrate to another country, I mean, you cannot imagine this kind of benefits or support. But we do not really share the strong bond, or we do not really have a very positive attitude as we did before. But based on the latent the thing about the government subsidies and the support, all of them is actually, the national identity lies in there. Because we strongly believe that we share the national identity with North Korea. And this is a country we used to be, one, and well, this is ethnic brothers, and so we have to support them if they are looking for our help. About the national identity, I mean, scholars usually divide it into two types: ethnic identity and civic identity. So civic identity relates to the respect to the society, the legal and political system, and values, and the culture, and etc. So how much do you have respect, and determines how much you have a civic identity with them. Ethnic identity, on the other hand, is about simply sharing the bloodline. And also you were born in that country and spent most of the life and share the history and etc. So it's not something that immigrants can have inherently. And among the national identity, when we talk about North Korea and North Korean defectors and unification, it all pinpoints to the ethnic identity. Without ethnic bondage that we were educated, why do we have to even think about unifying with that troublemaker? And why should we give all the privilege to the North Korean defectors? I mean, if you look into more detail, I mean, they have the same motivation to coming to South Korea with the other migrant group of people. Like those who are coming from Indonesia or Malaysia, they have the same reason coming to South Korea as the North Korean defectors. But because of this, the ethnic identity that we were taught we share with North Korea, that actually make it possible to give all the privileges and make South Koreans think that we have to give more special treatment to North Korean defectors. But the thing is, in recent times, the South Korean people are losing the emotional connection with North Korea. I mean, according to the ASEAN Institute's annual poll, we repeatedly ask what North Korea means to you. Then only around 20% of Korean people say that, well, they are one of us. The rest, they say, oh, it's a stranger or neighbor or enemy even. So the tendency has been there for a while, and so, I mean, particularly so for among the young generation, those in the 20s. I mean, they do not have any memory of being the one Korea, and even their parents do not have a direct memory of North Korea being the same Korea. So it is losing the connection emotionally and ethnically, and that's what is happening in South Korea. So at this point, I happen to have a question. So do we really consider them as our ethnic brothers? Or do we really, or rephrase it, do we really consider them our in-group member? That was the question that I wanted to tackle, and then I found the result. So in order to check, I use ASEAN Institute daily polls, and I actually set up the 3 premises. The first one is, well, so based on the conventional wisdom that we give the special treatment to North Korean defectors because we are ethnic brothers, so I wanted to test the statement. So those who have a strong ethnic identity should have positive attitude toward North Korean defectors because they are ethnic brothers. That's very conventional wisdom, and I have some doubts on that statement. So I wanted to test this. And then it's indirectly related to the first premise. So those who have negative opinions of immigrants have positive attitude toward North Korean defectors, because it is widely studied that those who have a strong ethnic identity have sort of a negative opinion of immigrants. And as I said, ethnic identity cannot be acquired by the immigrants because it's kind of generically you should have it. So if you follow the conventional wisdom that ethnic identity breeds a more welcoming attitude toward North Korean defectors, then that also means that they should have negative opinion toward immigrants, so they should be indirectly connected. And the third, I took the peculiarity of the North Korea into consideration. So we are always under the security threat from the North Korea. And I wanted to test the statement that security threat perception should not have influence on the perception of North Korean defectors if we maintain and still have the ethnic bondage with the North Korean defectors and it's working. Because once they flew from North Korea and came to South Korean society, and then we should consider them, as soon as they arrive there and integrate to the society. It's in-group members, not the out-group members anymore. But if we consider them as out-group members, then it should have some tainted image to the North Korean defectors, just like Arab Americans after 9/11, and also the Italian immigrants during the World War II period. I mean, they were kind of awkward situation. Their original country is fighting against the United States, which is a new country to them. So if the North Korean people can be separated by the South Korean people from the North Korea itself and the security threat, and they completely accept North Korean defectors into our society, then whatever security threat that posed by North Korea wouldn't really matter about the people's attitude towards North Korean people. So here's the list of my variables that I used to examine. So first, I measured the attitude towards the North Korean defectors and immigrants. This is all the code is from our survey result. So the attitude toward North Korean defectors and the immigrants is the score, basically. It is from 0 to 1 scale. So we asked, how do you feel about North Korea? So from the 0 is the most negative, or I dislike the North Korean defectors, and 10 is the most positive, or I really like the North Korean defectors. And the same way for the attitude toward the immigrants. So the higher the score is, which means that you have warmer and more close feeling toward the immigrants and the North Korean defectors. And for the ethnic identity, I picked 3 elements. So we asked if the respondents agree or disagree with the statement. First, to be a Korean should have the same the bloodline as a Korean. And the second, a Korean should be born in Korea. And the third is a Korean should have been living in Korea for the most of their lives. So these are measuring the 3 elements as measuring the level of strength of one's ethnic identity. We actually had the civic identity measures, which is, well, the different things. Koreans should abide by the political and legal system, they respect the culture, and these are measuring the civic identity level. But these 3, with this, I measure the strength of ethnic identity. And when a person said, "Oh no, I do not really think it's an important thing," for example, having a Korean bloodline is not really important to be a Korean, then we coded him with the person with a 0. Otherwise, we coded the person who has a strong ethnic identity and coded as 1. And evaluation of national security, we simply asked, how do you think about the national security currently? And 0 is coded as bad and 1 is good. We are fine. And opinion of the immigrant issues, the same way that we asked ethnic identity. We asked people to answer, agree or disagree with the statement. So for example, like immigrants increase the crime rate. If person agrees, then we coded the person in 1, and otherwise a 0. And the 2 other statements is immigrants take jobs away from South Koreans, and immigrants undermine the Korean values. And just for the test, I used a very simple t-test. So first, I calculate the mean numbers, the score of the attitude toward North Korean defectors and the immigrants, and then I compared the group means with the means with the different groups. For example, like what's the mean score of the North Korean defect closeness to the North Korean defectors among those who agree that having the same bloodline is important, and having the same bloodline is not important. So to compare them and having the difference and did the t-test, see that if there's any statistical significance. So for the first thing about ethnic identity and closeness to the North Korean defectors, as you see, for those people who answered that, well, having a Korean bloodline is not important, they have mean closeness score for North Korean defectors is 6.649. But those who answered yes, it is important, which means that they think that ethnic bloodline is very important, and which is, I interpret that ethnic identity is important when the very strong ethnic identity has a score of 6.0919, which means that as a person thinks that ethnic identity, particularly having the same bloodline, is not important, the person has more warmer feeling, more closer attitude toward the North Korean defectors than those who think that having bloodline is very important to be a Korean. And that is completely opposite from what we usually think. Because it seems that those who have a strong ethnic identity have colder feeling toward North Korean defectors. And 2 other ethnic identity elements show the same thing. So those who think that, well, being born in South Korea is not important, have a higher score than those who think being born in South Korea is important. So the first group has a score of 6.5. And the second group has a 6.0118. So, and the difference is 0.488. And both cases have, when we tested, when I did the t-test, it shows that it's statistically significant. So difference means something. The only thing that is not significant is the third one, the living in South Korea for the most of one's lives is important. Well, I mean, statistically, it's not really significant, but still the direction is the same. So out of this result, we can say that, contrary to our belief, once a person has a strong ethnic identity, the person is less likely to welcome the North Korean defectors. And the second, before I go to the second premise, I kind of compare with the people's attitude toward immigrants and the North Korean defectors. So in this case, I kind of classified the people into their numbers. So negative attitude, and then neutral attitude, and positive. So you see that there is a slight positive relationship between the attitude toward immigrants and attitude toward the North Korean defectors. For example, like those who think positively about the North Korean defectors also have a positive thinking about the immigrants too. So, I calculated a correlation coefficient too, and it was a 0.42. That is not a dramatically, really strongly positively correlated, but still is quite a big number. So it's not like in the 0.7 or 8, but I cannot deny that it's a relatively sizable number. And then when I get to the point, the opinion of migrants and the attitude toward North Korean defectors, I find a similar case that with the first one. So as a person think negatively about the immigrants, then the person also have the negative attitude toward the North Korean defectors. So when you, for example, those who agree that immigrants increase the crime rate, and their closeness score toward North Korean defectors is a 6.019, and those who disagree, their closeness score to North Korean defectors is 6.361. So the person who have a negative attitude toward immigrants and opinion of it and tend to have a lower score toward the North Korean defectors, which means that they have less warm feeling toward them. And the third, so this is about the perceived national security situation and attitude toward North Korean defectors, and those who think that those who think that the Korea is fine, so it's kind of weird. I should have written down the question wording, but so those who think that the Korea is natural and national security is fine tend to have more closer feeling toward North Korean defectors than those who think the Korean national security is in trouble. The score difference is 0.714, and of course it is also confirmed by the statistical significance by the t-test. So, I mean, it's quite unfortunate, and it also shows that those who have more seriously perceived the North Korean security threat, then they feel less close to North Korean defectors, and we cannot really successfully separate North Korea from the North Korean defectors. And, well, of course, I cannot really confidently say that, well, it shows that it just means that South Koreans and conceive the North Korean defectors as outgroup members. I cannot confirm that so strongly, but at least it shows that the ethnic bloodline is not really sufficient to protect North Korean defectors from North Korea's original sin. So I have to say that, then what? So to sum you up, contrary to our conventional belief, those have strong ethnic identity that tend to have a negative attitude toward North Korean defectors. That is completely different from what we expected. And also, it can show that for the emotional distance is observed among the South Korean public to the North Korean defectors. And here's the question, it is reported that the North Korean defectors, they are most resentful about the South Korean people are treating them as one of those migrant groups, not the North Korea people, so that they feel like they should receive some special treatment because they are from Korea, basically. But unfortunately, this is more and more so among the South Korean people. So more South Korean people are considering more like a migrant group about the North Korean defectors, and we can detect there's a fading ethnic bond between South and North Korean people, and it's not their fault. I would say that because we are overall losing the connection or emotional connection with the North Korea. So I like to emphasize one implication of this study which is the outlook of the post-unification of Korea. I mean, North Korean defectors are really small segment still of the population in South Korea. So either you embrace North Korean defectors as one of us and ethnic brothers and treat them really well, or treat them as a migrant group. It doesn't really matter because it's only 27,000 people living in South Korea. But if we ever unify, then the North Koreans actually constitute a third of the Korean population, which means that it's quite significant and very independent political bloc. And we have to pose the questions, are South Koreans ready to accept that under the name of the democracy? And that, I have a tremendous doubt on that. So, President Park, and she ambitiously launched the Unification Plan and tried to assure that economic prosperity that it can bring about, because she thinks that most Korean people are so worried and do not really want unification because of economic cost. But before we go there, I mean, she has to, and her government has to worry about how to forge the losing ethnic bond between South and the North if she really means for the unification in the future Korea. Well, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, it's hard to follow those two informative, fascinating presentations. And I'm going to shift to a different angle for thinking about North Korea in a broader context. So this is a more macro approach using not personal networks and not public opinion data, but the information from the journals and newspapers and books coming out of Japan. So basically, we have been approaching North Korea in the context of the nuclear crisis that began in 1993, so this is going on a quarter of a century, as a realist problem. How do countries come together to deal with a threat to security? So frequently there's been an emphasis that this is 5 versus 1. 5 countries agree that North Korea should not have nuclear weapons, and they all see this as a challenge to regional security. Therefore, they engage in diplomacy and cooperate in preparing for provocations in order to counter the threat from North Korea, deter it, change the environment. Now, what has troubled me in this line of reasoning over the years is the countries are not just approaching North Korea as a security issue. And we've heard that at the level of public opinion in South Korea, there is attention to ethnicity and finding some way to create the bonanza of unification. But it's not just South Korean attitudes. It's attitudes all around. So the six-party talks were much more than a diplomatic effort to find a way of managing the North Korean threat. And that has driven my approach to the issue for long. So basically, North Korea is easy to approach, not just strategically, but emotionally. For anyone with even a little twinge of conscience, there's a human rights issue. For many in South Korea who recognize that there, but for an accident of history, they would go, it evokes sympathy. For others who viscerally despise U.S. self-righteousness amid efforts to judge good and bad in other societies, it evokes some kind of defensive forgiveness. To manage North Korea's growing danger to the region and the world, and the complex diplomacy, the diplomatic jockeying of states toward North Korea, we need some deeper analysis of what's going on. It requires awareness of each country's thinking about North Korea, and so my approach today is to talk about Japan. Really, there are 3 successive circles in dealing with North Korea. The inner circle is the inter-Korean relationship, and that received a boost last year with President Park Geun-hye's decision to highlight reunification as an urgent objective. Below the surface lurked quieter forces of inter-Korean relations, as we've just been hearing. The intermediate circle is where the attention of most international observers is centered. That encompasses China and the United States, the two great powers that are contending for how one should deal with this, and where South Korea's own efforts are centered, how to manage the differences in Chinese and U.S. thinking about North Korea. Now, of late, the priorities have not been so much national identities. China says now, well, this is not the special relationship we had before. It's now a normal country-to-country relationship. I don't buy that, but that has been their stress. In the United States, the stress is, this is a security issue. This isn't we're not highlighting the danger of North Korean identity. We're highlighting the danger of North Korean nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. But if we go to the outer circle, so I'm putting aside the second circle, we go to the outer circle, we're talking about Russia and Japan. The other members of the six-party talks, countries that are seen to have a high stake in what happens to the Korean Peninsula. And I think in both countries this has very significant national identity impact, what they see as North Korea. I could talk at length about Russian thinking and how Russia's approach to North Korea has changed dramatically over the last year, with an emphasis on using North Korea as a way of strengthening their opposition to the United States and re-entering Asia, their pivot to Asia through North Korea. But really what I want to talk about is Japan, because I find the struggle between realism and revisionism in Prime Minister Abe's foreign policy particularly intriguing. And when you think of Abe's emphasis on strengthening Japanese right to collective self-defense, on national security, on boosting the alliance with the United States, as we will hear discussed 2 months from now when he speaks to a joint session of Congress, of strengthening ties to Australia and India and ASEAN and Southeast Asia. We really emphasize the realist side of Abe. Towards the South, Southeast Asia, he is primarily a realist. And right now, at least, the emphasis towards the United States is Japanese realism. But when you go to Japan towards South Korea, it's overwhelmingly revisionism. Their rethinking of the comfort women, their effort to, the sort of hate Korea theme that has been prominent in Japan for the last 2 years, as opposed to the love Korea of the Korea wave period, barely a decade ago. But both are involved in sort of emotional reaction to South Korea rather than some kind of realist thinking about how does South Korea serve as a partner in dealing with the North Korea threat. So there is a lot going on in Japanese identity towards South Korea we're aware of, but I think people aren't as much aware of the identity themes in Japan's approach to Russia and North Korea. So it's really Northeast Asia has a different place in Japanese thinking about the outside world in the struggle between revisionism and realism that is played out mostly domestically in Japan, with the fight between different newspapers and different political groups, the struggle over whether Japan has a realist approach or a revisionist approach. So this outer circle and its views on the Korean Peninsula, I think, has acquired greater urgency because both Japan and Russia have diplomatic initiatives toward North Korea that were apparent last year. And all of this occurs in the shadow of China and the Sino-U.S. relationship where both countries are active. So they both felt marginalized in the six-party talks, which really were much more 4 parties. At times 3 parties, and South Korea even, I think, felt marginalized. But they took pleasure in being included in the six-party talks when we go back to 2003, 2004. Yes, they're there. It wasn't like the late 90s when there were really four-party talks. Yes, they're going to have a say. They're being consulted in this shuttle diplomacy going from capital to capital. But as the talks proceeded, they both realized that they were really peripheral factors. They didn't have much influence. And then when the talks ended and things really broke down from 2009, they really felt they didn't matter at all. This was all about North Korea trying to provoke the United States to get a new approach from the U.S. South Korea was frustrated and being provoked in a more direct fashion with the attacks in 2010. China was being the center of the effort to try to find a new way to pressure North Korea, to reach North Korea. And then we got the change of leadership and so much attention focused on China's relations to North Korea. So both Russia and Japan felt that they had to do something new. And Japan, in addition, thought it didn't have a foothold in Northeast Asia, its own neighborhood. The relationship with China deteriorated so badly. The relationship with South Korea has been bad for well over 2 years. The relationship with Russia was bad and got worse for a while, and then Abe decided to focus on that, and then as well North Korea. So this is the context I want to discuss, Abe's regional approach and North Korea. So there's a symbol for each of the countries of Northeast Asia. For Russia, it's the northern territories, and they act as if this effort to reach out to Russia is about getting back islands that have been a big issue in Japanese national identity, at least since the beginning of the 1980s. But there's much more going on between Japan and Russia, and what they're going to get back if they make a deal is far less than they were seeking before. But nonetheless, they present it in this identity term, and meanwhile Japan and the United States have had a lot of tension over the last year since Abe went to the Sochi Olympics, unlike any other U.S. ally, and even President Park didn't go to the Sochi Olympics, understanding the U.S. Concern about what Russia was doing already before the Ukraine crisis broke. And then in the Ukraine crisis, Abe has agreed to the sanctions through the G7, but it's always with the image Japan is doing the least possible. It's trying to restart negotiations with Russia. It really isn't sympathetic to this approach to sanction Russia. And there's still much talk in Japan that Putin is visiting this year, and that there's going to be a breakthrough this year. And much of the discussion in Japan is not just about the breakthrough to get islands, and they leave it vague as if they're going to get 4 islands, which nobody thinks is at all possible, 3 islands, which would be considered a great compromise, and Japan now would be delighted to get those 3 islands, in the leadership at least. 2 islands, which Russia has promised on many occasions in the past secretly, and would probably willingly give, and that's probably the deal Japan would have to settle for. And yet there's much more about why would it settle for this deal now when it defies this joint diplomacy. But really, North Korea is seen through the lens of the abduction issue. Japan has this image that there are people still alive who are abducted. There are remains of others to be returned. There's a story to be told. North Korea has been leading Japan on since early last year about how they can reach an agreement. It's promised to provide new information, and the deadline keeps getting postponed, and yet Japan keeps looking at this. But really, the abduction issue is just the tip of the iceberg of what the Japanese have been thinking about with regard to North Korea. One thing is it's not unrelated to South Korea. So with South Korea, they feel there's been a honeymoon with China. They regard South Korea as emotionally hostile to Japan, that their apologies have not been accepted, that they can't receive any understanding from South Korea. There's this sort of huge emotional gap right now, that they disagree about not just how to deal with China, but about something more fundamental. So rather than highlighting the fact that both countries are democracies, allies of the United States, share a great deal in common in many aspects of national identity, they are preoccupied with the difference over national identity, the gap, as if it's unbridgeable with South Korea of late. And North Korea provides an end around for South Korea. North Korea has to make a history agreement with Japan, and in talks both in 1989-1990, when Kanemaru Shin led negotiations with North Korea that were seen as rather suspect in South Korea, and then in 2002, when Koizumi Junichiro was the prime minister and he led efforts to reach a breakthrough, there was a sense that a deal was possible with North Korea essentially doing what South Korea did in 1965 and what China did in 1972, and saying, we need your money, we need your a resolution of our relationship, and we will agree to some kind of statement that sort of puts history aside and ends the legal and obligations. Japan has ended those problems with every other country but not North Korea. And if it did so with North Korea, it would put South Korea in a more difficult position. Because as if South Korea is bringing up history and North Korea is not. Now, of course, if there's no deal, North Korea will be the most vehement in attacking Japan on history. And this year, being the 50th anniversary in June of the normalization with South Korea, and being the 70th anniversary in August or early September of the end of the war, is bringing out all the emotions about history issues. And how can Japan get through this year with relatively little damage, while Abe continues his quest for a revisionist approach to history in terms of essentially justifying the historical conduct of Japan while agreeing to some rather ambiguous apologies. And so North Korea is a means, just as Russia is a means, because the territorial issue is seen as the residue of 1945, and if that can be resolved, it'll be seen as a huge effort towards a normal Japan that has put the past behind it. So when you look at the debate, which is often somewhat indirect in Japan about history issues regarding, and the other themes regarding North Korea, you see that the abductee issue is just the facade. There's much more potentially going on there, although in terms of real security, Japan remains strongly concerned about the North Korea threat, and cooperative with the United States in ballistic missile defense, more so than Korea is, and in preparing for the damage. But when much of the discussion in Japan has centered much more on the China danger than on the North Korea danger, and the discussion on North Korea is left rather incomplete. So if you look at Japanese national identity and you ask, what are the themes, the dimensions of identity that relate to how it's dealing with North Korea and all of Northeast Asia. You can go through each of what I call the 6 dimensions of national identity. So the first one is ideology, and I believe what Abe stands for and the Japanese right stands for is an ideology. It's so deep, it covers everything, really. They want to destroy the Asahi Shimbun and the progressive movement and the pacifist thinking and the enemy within the country. They've been against it all along, and they want to create a sense of normal Japan that has its own identity, not just as part of the West. In fact, it's distant from the West, more distant, but it hasn't been able, it's been frustrated, it hasn't been able to come forward. Japan has been so dependent on the United States, and increasingly now, really, that it can't express the true emotions of the right-wing Japanese toward the U.S. And the U.S. is the biggest problem, really, because it's the Tokyo Tribunal, it's the San Francisco Peace Treaty, it's even Pearl Harbor. There's a lot there. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not a feeling of strong closeness with the U.S. as a realist partner and as a country now which supports the values that stand opposed to Chinese values. But there's something else going on in this ideology beyond this. And that's why I would argue that Northeast Asia is their opportunity to express this in international terms, not just in domestic terms. Now, how has this been expressed in the Japanese media? I think it's been expressed in suspicion of Obama. That the right wing has frequently suggested that Obama is weak in dealing with China. That, of course, the U.S. expression of disappointment at Abe's visit to Yasukuni attracted quite a bit of negative coverage of Obama on the right. And that was but the visit to Yasukuni was really not just about showing China and Korea and the Japanese right that Abe is on his own course. It was also a statement to the United States, because he knew how hard the U.S. was trying to keep him from going to the Yasukuni. So Biden's visit, Hagel and Kerry's visit, there were just one effort on the U.S. knew this visit there's a possibility of going to Yasukuni. It was doing everything you can imagine to stop that visit, and it failed. And that was partly, I think, of Abe saying, we're no longer listening to the U.S. the way we once did. This is our effort. So I would call this an idea. History is huge in East Asia. It's not a minor dimension of identity. It is the center of discussion of identity. And I think we pay too much attention to Japan's revisionism as the main historical theme when everybody else has it. I regard it in China as enormous, and we'll see it particularly this year, that the history issue is a big part of Chinese national identity, and that contributes to the struggle against not only Japan but the United States, demonizing the U.S. and Western views of history and trying to come up with a very different view. So that is a dimension where Japan's policies towards the Korean Peninsula matter. Why is South Korea such a problem for Japan? Because it is the country that takes history most seriously in relationship with Japan. It's so much is about history. And so if history is so critical to the Japanese right conservative identity, then how can they deal with South Korea, which is so critical of Japanese history? The third dimension, which is not important for South Korea, more important for the United States really, but also for China, is some sense of the state-society relationship. That Japan in the 1980s in particular, was distinguished itself from the West in terms of the state society and individualism and community. And I think that continues to be a barrier for Japanese to think they're part of this same wider rule. They want to emphasize that they're really different in the way they organize this society, and I think the conservatives in particular, with their emphasis on patriotism and rebuilding the sense of kokutai, the state, have this in mind. Another dimension is civilizations. I think we got on the wrong track, but we were pointed to the right subject when Huntington's Clash of Civilizations came out. That China and Japan see things very much in terms of, and Russia, civilizations, and that they represent separate civilizations. And this is a big part of their identity. And in international relations, Japan has this sense of Asianism, re-entering Asia, getting some foothold in Asia that gives Japan a separate identity from the West. It's not just part of the West. And so North Korea and Russia are opportunities for Japan to begin to rebuild this. It also looks at ASEAN and India as very special partners for this. India, in part because the Indian judge voted against the Tokyo Tribunal, and Abe made a very important gesture when he was prime minister before by going to the home of this judge and sort of saying, I recognize your contribution to the India-Japan rejection of the colonial system that meant that Japan was a factor in liberating India from Britain at the end of the war. And Southeast Asia, you would think that Japan and the United States are so close together in boosting ASEAN and standing together and strengthening Southeast Asia versus some of China's intentions, but there's really an independent Japanese hope, too. So Asianism as a theme matters a good deal in this. And above all, I think what we neglect is the intensity of national identity, this dimension of intensity. That the sense that national identity is so important for for international relations and for sense. Americans, I just don't think, have been accustomed to thinking of that way. Well, let me just conclude then by saying Japan doesn't want to be marginalized, wants to see itself as an autonomous international actor that can reemerge on the scene using strong ties to the United States, as it has since 1945, but also charting its independent course, standing up more directly to the United States as part of becoming a normal great power, finding partners in Asia, hoping that in this outcome of the jockeying over North Korea, it can get some leverage, it can find some way of using North Korea, also splitting Russia and China, and in a minor way, it exaggerates what it might do, and so on, and putting pressure on South Korea to accept Japan with its revisionist agenda, as well as with its realist agenda, which South Korea has been reluctant to acknowledge. So with all of those thoughts in mind, I think we're talking about the transformation of North Korea as an international issue deeply shaped by national identities. I'll stop there. Thank you. Okay, we entertain questions, and I'm sure you'll have a lot for my co-panelists because of the exciting nature of their topics. Jane.
Well, fascinating seminar this morning. Although it's Sunday, I think the temperature of our discussion is quite high. Quick question to Sandra and June. The unification through mobile phones, that's a fascinating subject, and I think that this will further develop into the future as the technology proceeds. my question is, do you think that this phenomenon, the unification through cellular phone and the communication, will actually increase the defection from North Korea or decrease it? I think it perhaps works in two different ways. I just want to hear your view. And June, your conclusion is quite intriguing, actually. Those with a strong ethnic identity are less friendly to North Korean defectors. One way to explain that could be a hypothesis that there might be some reverse relationship in terms of perception of the South Korean perception of the North Korean regime and South Korean perception of the North Korean defectors. In other words, if you think that Kim Jong-un regime is worse than Kim Jong-il regime in terms of human rights or repression, that you might have a sympathetic view towards the North Korean defectors. Is that what you have found, or is there some other explanation? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question, and it's really interesting because the fact that there are more North Korean defectors talking to their family directly back home doesn't equally translate into increased defection. As I kind of hinted at in the talk, I'm really glad that you picked it up so I could speak about it. I was, in Seoul, I think it was in January, and I was with a North Korean defector friend of mine, and she received a phone call from her mother, who was in North Korea, and her mother was saying, well, they started arguing on the phone. A very quick phone call, and her mother was saying, her mother doesn't really want to come out. Her mother wants to stay in North Korea and continue to receive remittances and things like this. Now, why doesn't her mother want to come out? This is the more interesting question, I think. And it kind of relates to what I was saying before about family ties and kinship. I mean, there's this kind of paradox, because sometimes the family ties and kinship result in increased affection for some groups of people, but for other people, they want to stay inside North Korea because they have more friends in North Korea, they have more family in North Korea. I mean, especially for older generation of North Korean defectors, they feel very lonely in South Korea. So if they have this kind of Mount Hala stream, this money flowing back in, that was the primary reason why many people left. Economic, even poverty. Poverty was why the majority of people left. If you ask people directly, are you leaving because of political persecution? I mean, they don't really identify political aspects in terms of defection, by and large, right? So, I think I would like to encourage, if there's some young researchers out there, I mean, this is an area, how many North Korean defectors use mobile phones? How often are they talking with family back home in North Korea? This type of thing is something that I would like to see, extensive research on. So thanks for the question.
So you asked, is there any reverse relationship, North Korean regime and North Korean defectors? So, for example, my quick answer is no. Well, I would say that for the North Korean regime and Kim Jong-un, yes, I mean, it's horrible and terrible, and even we are ridiculed the Kim Jong-un, because they are saying that on the TV, oh yeah, he gained weight this time, etc. So I think currently the perception of North Korea is probably at the bottom. And about the North Korean defectors, maybe it's not true that we hate them or we ridicule them, but it's becoming more like indifferent or not really interested in them. So before it was, oh yeah, North Korean defectors, they came to South Korea, they agree with us and we have to treat them very well because, all kinds of reasons, but we see them quite often. And we do not have much of motivation to treat them, especially, and that's what my study found. Even though it's not included in my paper this time, but we also have people's attitude and perception of North Korean people. It's not the defectors, but not the North Korean regime. And then we compare the score with the Americans and Japanese and Chinese, and of course it is reflecting the people's favorability toward the countries. Because usually, if you favor one country, then you have a nice attitude and opinion of the people of the country. And then, of course, the American people are the top. And then it was Chinese. then it was North Korean. Of course, the rock bottom is Japanese for obvious reason. So it's not just, so we are losing the sympathy to North Korean defectors. I mean, many and more South Koreans, they say, well, it's an open country and we are receiving a lot of migrants from other countries too, so why we should treat them more specially. That's becoming, it's not really prevalent as of now, but it is, distributed or disseminated more widely, more recently, I have to say.
Thanks, and I would say the panel made it very worth getting up early on a Sunday morning, so KEI can be happy that they saved the best for last. Two questions, one for Ji-Yeon and then one for Gil. Ji-Yeon, just before my question, there'd be if you go to, I live in Singapore, and there's very strong discussions in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan how there's a growing civic identity that differentiates them from mainland Chinese. So it would be kind of interesting twist. I was wondering if you looked at the correlation between feelings towards North Korean defectors and support for unification. Do people who don't see unification anytime soon or don't want it, often for economic reasons, how they view defectors. And for Gil, I wanted to ask if here in your paper, which I haven't had a chance to look at yet, whether you looked at the kind of Abe's political rise and his connection to the abduction issue, because certainly him and Aso, even within the LDP, rose partially through the abduction issue and a domestic political argument that for a long time both the socialists and the left-wing LDP denied that the abductions actually happened. So there's a very powerful domestic or even personal political dimension. In his first term, I spent a week as a guest of the Chief Cabinet Secretary visiting all of the sites where the abductions happened, talking to policemen in Niigata City with the hope that I would go back to Australia and write an op-ed saying this is an international human rights travesty. I didn't write the op-ed and they didn't invite me back. But
you know what, actually the original title I prepared for this panel was People's Attitude toward North Korean Defectors and Reunification. The reason I quit in the middle and changed the subject was because I couldn't find any clear direction or relationship. The reason I thought was because if you are asked as a Korean and about the unification question, there's no way that you can say that, no, I don't want it. So there's not much variation in that variable. So that's probably why it's all messed up, the people's attitude towards the defectors and the unification. So I mean, it's impossible. Even if I were asked about the unification, it's hard to deny that I don't want it. I mean, you need some courage to say it in front of it. So that was the reason. So sorry about that. I didn't give you the clear answer for it, but that's what I have.
Well, I like your question, Malcolm. Actually, I had a similar experience, but for a different issue. I was taken up to Nemuro, where there are where you can see the islands in dispute with Russia, and the effort was to rally international opinion behind Japan's just cause in getting the return of these islands, as if this is the central issue. And you're absolutely right that the strong conservatives, the right in Japan, have played on these emotional issues, sort of immigration. We know how conservative movements do that in many countries, including our own, to try to say that the foreign ministry, the State Department, much of the media are just not sensitive to what really matters for the national identity of the country. And so Abe used this abduction issue skillfully after Koizumi Japanese visit exposed the problem in 2001 to become the heir apparent to Koizumi. So he was the true backer, and the people who talked about sort of realist diplomacy in the region, such as Tanaka Hitoshi in the foreign ministry, were marginalized and even subject to harassment by right-wing groups who are, very active and with loudspeakers and sometimes violence. And so what we have here in Japan is that Abe is associated with this emotional issue, and therefore bringing it up again, even though it wasn't coordinated with South Korea or the United States in his diplomatic initiatives to North Korea, seemed like just his obligation to the suffering families and to those who wonder if their disappeared relatives actually ended up in North Korea. And so he can play on this emotional issue. And to some extent in South Korea, in Japan, they've suggested that this really has nothing to do with security. They are still very committed to dealing with North Korea, and this is really a minor issue, only narrowly focused on satisfying promises to family members. But as North Korea has failed to deliver on the promises in these talks that are now at least 6 months late in achieving the results that Abe was expected, the family members are getting more frustrated and are saying, why aren't you, getting tougher? After all, you dropped certain sanctions against North Korea to get these talks going. Why are you now not toughening up? And meanwhile, there's this background theme of what maybe Japan wants something more from the North Korea talks. But I think you're absolutely right to say this is a special theme for Abe that he can't easily get away from. Katie?
Hi, thank you all so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins University, and it's a really great opportunity to be here and see you all speak. So my question is sort of broadly to all of the panelists. You all touched on how South Korea and North Korea no longer, maybe the ethnic homogeneity and shared ethnic ties between the two countries are no longer a factor in, wanting reunification or having sympathy for North Korean defectors. So my question is, without this commonality and this factor encouraging sympathy among South Koreans and the lack of, shared commonalities between the two countries and other areas, how do you think that going forward that will affect bilateral relations between the two countries?
Who wants to start?
I'll start since I seem to be most ready to start. It's a great question. Time changes things. Time is changing both North and South Korea. People speak about them as having one culture, but I would strongly disagree with that. And if you look at the work of Gyeokshin, and of course what Ji and Kim has already demonstrated, the argument that ethnicity is ethnic homogeneity is a glue that's pulling people together is a bit of a farce. There's not much evidence. The Korean War shows that wasn't the case, and ideology is the thing which is separating people. So I think it doesn't bode well for what's to come, and North Koreans may be more and more isolated. The thing that I did try to emphasize in the paper was that I think family, it's coming up again with the abduction issue, these are family members asking for each other, and while it is a small percentage, I think that as a social institution may bear some indication of paths to go in the future. More defectors are coming out. They're worried about family and friends back home. Whether or not it would mean that there's unification is another thing. But that's why I also emphasized, I mean, perhaps in terms of technology. I mean, why are we thinking in terms of analog? You know, I mean, we're really moving into another age. So that might hold potential for things in the future. I'll look forward to hearing what other people have to say here.
Do you want to?
I have a really quick answer. Well, first of all, I have never been a big fan of ethnic identity. I never believed in that. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, it's not really completely made up, but is, I think, overrated. That's my personal belief. So, and that was infused to Korean people during, as Professor Kyuk-shin mentioned in his book, and very well summarized in his book, that during the colonial period, and it was used during the authoritarian regime again, and to confront North Korea. And then it's a really big question how to continue the bilateral relationship between the South and the North. I do not have an answer because I'm not an expert in international relationship and relations, and etc. But I think one thing that at least South Korea can do is, I mean, you cannot have a good relationship with another country, I would say the North Korea, another country, by ridiculing it. And either you have the upper hand, complete upper hand, or confront a more serious the position with serious perspective. And if you really have a willingness to go for the unification, you have to approach it from that perspective. I mean, it's not like, so just evaluating the current position of the Park Geun-hye government, it seems that they are not really moving forward, but they are not backing up either. So it's the same as in the realm they're dealing with the Japan and Abe administration. That's what I think. So either go for it, like President Kim Dae-jung did. It doesn't necessarily mean that I support that, but well, if you're really serious about the unification, I personally think that you should have a complete upper hand. And otherwise, I don't know, how can you deal with those rascals? That's what I think. Yeah, I'll stop here.
I'll add a little bit to this. In the last year, the Dresden speech was a year ago, highlighting this reunification theme. I think South Korea has tried to make reunification a big theme, and there have been a lot of conferences and discussions in the U.S. too on this. You know, how should we prepare for reunification? It's been raised to the forefront, but I actually don't see how we get to reunification because I think the great powers are so divided. And China is so opposed to reunification on terms that South Korea would want, that South Korean thinking about how to get to reunification assumes or I think misrepresents what Chinese are really doing. And I think Chinese are playing South Korea along about what they would be willing to do. Not that they won't agree to some kind of reunification, but those circumstances are unrealistic, inconceivable in my mind. So I really think we're in for an extended period of coexistence and tension that will be very difficult to manage, and that all the discussion about what we do if is based on assumptions that really are unlikely to be borne out. Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much for your papers. I too agree that I'm glad I woke up early to come to this session. I'm with the East-West Center, and a big part of the work that I do is working with teachers from all over the U.S., but also in the Asia-Pacific region. And we had groups of Korean teachers in the U.S. and also had groups of U.S. teachers in Korea. And most of the U.S. teachers were struck by the fact that there was very little willingness or interest in discussing North Korean issues among teachers, and likewise in the classrooms of students. And so following that, this just happened recently, so we did a survey of about 1,600 Korean students, mostly at the middle, junior high school and high school students. And because, when we talk about unification, it's always talked about in the context of the future. And, certainly something like 15, 20 years away. And so we wanted to see what young people who are going to be in the middle of, if that happens, dealing with unification issues, what they thought of it. And what struck us was 70% thought that Korea will reunite, but in 20 years, 20 plus years. Of those, 50% thought unification is necessary. 70% said they have no family or relatives in North Korea. And 86% said they were very worried about nuclear war, nuclear issues with North Korea. And 43% said they have no sense of connection with North Korea or North Koreans. And so when we look at these numbers, you wonder, what does it all mean? And I know some of you talked about how are they preparing. South Korea, certainly when you look at the rhetoric coming out, they're always thinking in terms of it will eventually happen. And if that is the case, how are they really preparing? Not just at the national sort of policy level, but even at the people sort of in terms of social integration. And I'm love to kind of hear your thoughts in terms of, these are just questions. We're just trying to figure out what does it all mean, and we want to think about some ways to engage South Korean students in terms of, well, if that were to happen, how might you help think about newcomers, North Koreans coming in? How can you help them make sense of how to integrate? We're thinking of some sort of project-based learning kinds of things that we could engage students, but I would just love to hear some thoughts from you, those of you who've been doing this kind of research. Where do we go from, here in terms of sort of South Korean and young people thinking about this, how they shape this future?
Well, because there's a numbers, I'll start. First of all, it's amazing that you did 1,600 students. That's quite a lot, big size of sample. Well, it said that, the unification will happen probably 10 or 20 years later. The South Korean people answered it exactly the same way 20 years ago. So that means that we really expect the unification in 10 and 20 years, but it just means that it's in the future. Not really known and how long it will take, but it's simply just in the future it will happen. But probably I'm not really interested right now immediately. And it said that 50% of students answered that is unification necessary. That is quite low, in fact. When we do the survey, the South Korean adults, it's usually 80%. As I said, how dare you say that unification is not necessary? And that is not that is not politically correct. So you usually say, yeah, it is necessary, and then there's a follow-up questions. Well, maybe we have to, under some circumstances, you have to keep the pace, and if there's any difficulties or like economic difficulties, maybe then you put some reservation that way. So 50%, students are quite frank. I don't think it's completely frank. I would say that maybe just 10 or 20% of students agree that we need a net unification. But still, the 50% said it is necessary. That is quite low from the average. And, 43% students said no sense of connection with the North Korea. And I kind of understand. That is, I still think it's kind of overrated. But it's really understandable. And those, let me see, junior high and high school students, they're probably third and fourth generation after the Korean War. So it's very natural for them to not have any memory or any connection, emotional connection with North Korea. What they saw, because they remember most recent happenings and events, what they saw was North Korean attacking South Korea. Cheonan sinking of Cheonan, and also shelling of Yeonpyeong Island and everything, they saw as North Korea's military provocation. Maybe when they come up to the formative age, like adolescents, like 20s, in their 20s, and something really nice happened between two Koreas, then they may have some, reform their memory of the North Korea and have more positive attitude toward it. But so far, from the young age, what they remember about North Korea is they are attacking us. And that is also a very important factor playing in the psychology of the young male in South Korea. I mean, if you look at how the young male, like in their 20s, think about North Korea and the security issues, I mean, they are even more conservative than the elderly, because they saw what happened in 2010, and these are a group of people who actually have to serve the military duties. And they think that, physical threat, basically. About unification, unification is, I would say, that's all South Korean president's dream. No matter what you have done during your presidency, how much you screwed up the domestic politics, but if you can lay out some cornerstone for the unification, then you will be remembered in the history that the one who completed or achieved the unification, and that is a big thing for the Korean president. So that's probably why the President Park Geun-hye wanted to go for the unification agenda all of a sudden. But one thing to figure out about how you engage or integrate the North Korean people into South Korean society, there's a very, I think, the unilateral dimension perspective, I will say, because what we have to think about right now is not just North Korean defectors or North Korean people. South Korea is more open than before. Now we have surpassed the 3% of population is from the foreign countries. I wouldn't say that this is a multicultural country, but it's still a very small segment of the population. But the Korean government, since President Lee Myung-bak's presidency, they are advertising that Korea should be more open and embrace those multicultural families and people from outside and etc. So I would say this is not particularly the multicultural society or education. That's totally wrong, I would say, but it's my personal opinion. But it is kind of political advertisement and propaganda since President Lee Myung-bak. But at the same time, if you want to fulfill the unification, this is completely very much the ethnic agenda. As I said, why would we unify with the North Korea? Except for our ethnic bondage provided a reason. So this multicultural agenda and the unification, the ethnic identity agenda, they cannot really, coexist peacefully. So how to reconcile these two and bridge the gap? That will be the big question for the government, and I do not really have a clear answer for that.
But hasn't President Park presented this as an opportunity for South Koreans?
Yeah, for economic prosperity. Yeah.
For those who don't have jobs, you can go and...
Well, it's going to take 1,000 years, not 1,000, but so much years. After unification, I don't really expect the South Korean economy will settle down for 10 or 20 years. And this is all about really, really rosy map she provided, but how realistic it is, that's another question. And I have a bunch of other stories I heard from my colleagues, and is it really possible in North Korea? It's not just, because North Korea only had the cheap labor. Other than that, you do not have a big infrastructure, you do not have transportation. So what else do you have in North Korea? So it seems, it's only the relying on the cheap labor, and it's going to catch up with the South Korean labor. Once you unified, can you imagine North Korean laborers and unskilled laborers can stand with that cheap, the lower salaries and lower money, and compare with the South Koreans? For a while, I would guess. So that is just one story, but there's a bunch of other stories, and well, it is very rosy map, and it's all about very hopeful thinking and wishful thinking. I'm too negative.
I'm going to address your question to you as a teacher. You said that I presume you're also a teacher and you're working with students, so I'm going to try to answer it within that framework. I think I agree with what you're saying. There's a lot of research done in South Korea, a lot of publications that are aimed at young students, like Our Generation and the Reunification, these kind of publications that come out. And I suspect, I'm not teaching at that level, I teach at a university level, but I suspect that the image that's given when we talk about unification is of two separate, completely separate countries. And in fact, yes, they are separate. Constitutionally in some ways, one claims the other, but anyway. But it's not the complete picture. And so I would encourage educators to let young people know, whether they're in America or in South Korea or in Japan, that there's loads of engagement that's happening inside North Korea. We have the Korean American Medical Association that does lots of work inside North Korea, fascinating work. There's loads of different NGOs. If you want, we can chat after and I can give you a list of some things that students could map. And they could look at the map of the DPRK and they could see where different countries are doing different practices and investment, economic investment, agricultural investment, different kinds of work that people are actually doing, whether they're South Korean or Korean American or JL Kyopo, Japanese Koreans, etc., etc. So the notion that these two countries are separate and then need to be brought back together, again, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm looking much more at people, much more at networks, much more at what's already happening. So I don't think it's a complete picture that they're two completely separate yolks that have to be unified in that manner. That to encourage young people to see the engagement that's already happening. And I'll just say, so the second thing that I wish to say is that, of course, a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old could easily say, if you put these two countries together, it's going to be a disaster. You don't need to be an economic expert, political expert, a social expert to say, putting these two very different countries together is going to be a disaster, even if it happened peacefully. Even if the North Korean government were to say tomorrow, you know what, South Korea, you got it right, we're joining you, it would still be a disaster. Now, I'm not saying that I wouldn't think it's a great idea. It's a great idea. But, culturally they're very different. Linguistically now, the countries are quite different. The kind of sagobangsik, the way of thinking is very different, I think, between North and South. As Dr. Kim mentioned, South Korea is far more multicultural than North Korea. So there are all these things that will have to be dealt with. So of course people are kicking the can down the road. Of course. This is the most logical thing to do, is to kick the can down the road. But to remind students not to feel that this is something we have to just throw up our hands and abandon. Because as I mentioned, there's already this kind of engagement. There's already these kind of social networks and practices that are happening. Yes, the two states see themselves as sovereign entities. But there are exchanges happening between Canada and Europe and countries in North Korea, and organizations inside North Korea. So I could go on, but if you want, let's chat after, and I can give you some links that you could share with your students.
Well, our time has come to an end, and please join me in thanking my fellow panelists and concluding the session.